And with that, I would call on, I believe, Mrs. Scanlon from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so we have a bill here which is pretending to protect our election systems from people who are not citizens voting in our federal elections. But let's be clear that that's not happening. It's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, and there is no evidence that non-citizens are voting in federal elections. No study backs this up. Including, in fact, to the contrary, the Cato Institute has put out a study that found that non-citizens don't vote illegally in detectable numbers. Sure, things happen everywhere, but this is not a real issue. Voter fraud is incredibly rare, and non-citizen voting is even more rare. So all this bill is going to do is disenfranchise American citizens. This bill repeats the GOP playbook for modern-day voter suppression, which we've already seen and rejected in my home state or Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and numerous other states. So by that I mean when you implement strict voter ID requirements which discriminate against eligible voters by limiting the forms of ID which the law will recognize for voting purposes. The classic example is the state that allows voters to vote if they have a hunting ID but not a student ID. So we don't need to look too far for examples of restrictive ID. One of the primary forms of ID allowed by this bill is real ID, which, as Chairman Stile noted, it does not, in fact, say that it shows citizenship, and in fact, non-citizens can get real ID in a number of different situations, and not all states indicate citizenship. So we're imposing yet another burden upon our states if they're going to have to go back and add citizenship to their real ID issuance. But beyond that, again, something we're very familiar with in Pennsylvania is that people have not gotten real ID. It's estimated that only 20% of eligible Pennsylvanians will have real ID by the time it becomes mandatory in a year. Other states are similar. Kentucky, I think, is only around 30%, because many states had large conservative factions who were afraid of real ID, who did not want it to be mandatory because they did not want there to be a national ID system. They did not want big government issuing national ID. So there's been very slow uptick, and it's kind of, I think as Mr. Morelli noted, it's a little bit odd that we have the House Republicans pushing additional requirements here upon our states and upon people who are resistant to Big Brother knowing everything about them. We saw the privacy concerns, the low acceptance rate of real ID, and it's been around since 2005, and we still have less than half the people who could get it using it. Shows that if you put an administrative burden on citizens to prove their citizenship, in order to register to vote, if you don't make it easy for them to do that, you're going to reduce the number of registered voters, which is something that we had to address when we had strict voter ID rules in Pennsylvania, and we proved that 600,000 eligible voters in Pennsylvania were going to be disenfranchised because the forms of ID, which had been accepted by the Republican legislature under that legislation, were too restrictive, and we see a similar thing happening here. If this bill passes and it's implemented nationwide, Republicans will have taken away the vote from millions of eligible American voters. Not to mention that it's going to place a significant financial and administrative burden on our state governments, which are already struggling to keep up with the requirements for real ID and other forms here. Do our Republican colleagues know this? Did they not do their homework when drafting this bill, or was the purpose of the bill not really to address this non-existent problem, but just to give an opportunity to talk about voter fraud that doesn't exist? So it's pushing lies about our elections. It's really problematic, and I just obviously can't support this bill because it goes contrary to all of the evidence and a lot of work that I've seen and participated in over the years. Ranking Member Morelli, Mr. Style mentioned that Real ID in and of itself doesn't indicate citizenship, and that not all states have such a marker. Has there been any testimony or any evidence before the committee, which brings this bill to us, about how many states do indicate citizenship?
No, there's no requirement that Real ID have citizenship on it. So even though it's cited as documentary evidence, it's only for those states who would require citizenship on Real ID. But Real ID does not, as the chairman indicated, does not have that requirement. I mean, here's the challenge: is it's going to take an armful of documentary evidence and a lot of work now to register to vote. The barriers for married women who have a different name than is on their birth certificate. And even if they showed a birth certificate, their driver's license, they're going to have two different names. One is the name that they were given at birth. One is if they've changed their name, those aren't going to agree. You're going to have to provide documentary. I mean, think about this, the steps that you'll need to take simply to register, which is your right as a U.S. citizen to vote in elections. But now you're going to have to go through more information than you'd have to do almost any other activity, and this is guaranteed by law. It really is shocking the amount of evidence will be necessary. And by the way, if you went to register to vote and you had a birth certificate and your married name, or I'm sorry, a driver's license, your married name, and a birth certificate with a different name, and the poll worker knew you because they're in the same neighborhood, and so I'm going to let this person register to vote, they did that, they'd be guilty of a federal crime. They could face jail time. And by the way, it doesn't mean that you weren't a U.S. citizen. It just means they didn't compile the proper documentary evidence because they knew who you were. I mean, is that what we want now for poll workers who know you, who know you're a citizen, who live down the street from you to be facing jail time because they didn't get the documentary evidence that they thought was, that the bill requires as evidence that you're a U.S. citizen? Boy, that's shocking to me.
Well, it's shocking and it's chilling of probably one of our most fundamental American rights to have a say in who runs the country, who we get to vote for. So thank you for your testimony. I would yield back.